The marble steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral gleamed under the morning sun as guests filed in, their designer outfits and expectant faces reflecting the grandeur of what should have been New York's wedding of the year. Inside, flower arrangements worth thousands of dollars lined the aisles, their perfume mixing with the scent of anticipation. Sarah Miller stood in the bridal suite, her hands steady as she adjusted her custom-made veil. The dress, a masterpiece of silk and lace, had cost more than most people's yearly salary. But when you're marrying one of New York's most eligible bachelors, Eric Johnson, everything had to be perfect. Her bridesmaids fussed around her, but Sarah barely noticed them. Her mind was already at the altar, imagining the moment she'd say, "I do" to the men she'd loved for the past 3 years. Meanwhile, in a separate room, Eric Johnson paced back and forth, his Italian leather shoes wearing an invisible path in the carpet. His best man, James, watched with growing concern as beads of sweat formed on Eric's forehead despite the room's perfect temperature. The weight of the occasion seemed to press down on Eric's shoulders, making his custom tuxedo feel like a straitjacket. The ceremony began precisely at 11 a.m. 300 guests stood as the orchestra struck the first notes of the wedding march. Sarah's entrance was everything everyone expected, graceful, radiant, perfect. She floated down the aisle, her eyes fixed on the spot where Eric should have been standing. Should have been. The murmurs started at the back of the church. They rippled forward like a wave, growing in volume until they reached Sarah. Eric wasn't at the altar. The bestman stood alone, his face ashen, holding his phone with trembling hands. Sarah's steps faltered, but she kept walking, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were telling her. Then James stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper, "He's gone." The chaos that followed was surprisingly quiet. No screaming, no dramatic fainting, just the soft rustle of expensive fabric as guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the muted sobs of Sarah's mother, and the sharp click of heels as the maid of honor rushed to catch Sarah before her knees gave out. Outside, Eric Johnson was already in his Porsche, speeding away from the cathedral, from responsibility, from love. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages and calls, but he ignored them all. The city stretched before him like an escape route, promising freedom from expectations, from commitment, from the suffocating pressure of forever. Back at the church, Sarah stood perfectly still in the middle of the aisle, her white dress now a symbol of something entirely different than what she'd intended. Guests began to leave, their whispered condolences hanging in the air like the flower petals that would never be thrown. Her father attempted to shield her from the pitying looks, but Sarah saw them all. She memorized every face, every expression, every moment of this humiliation. As the last guests filtered out, Sarah finally moved. With mechanical precision, she removed her veil, placed it on a pew, and walked out of the church. Her spine was straight, her head held high, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. The Sarah Miller who had walked into the church that morning, trusting, loving, optimistic, was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone who would remember this day not as an ending, but as a beginning. The next 5 years unfolded like a study in contrasts. Sarah Miller transformed her pain into purpose, channeling every ounce of hurt into her law school applications. She traded wedding magazines for law textbooks, replacing dreams of white picket fences with aspirations of judicial gavels. Harvard Law School accepted her with a partial scholarship, and she threw herself into her studies with an intensity that both impressed and concerned her professors. Her apartment near campus became a fortress of legal knowledge. Case files replaced photo albums, and late-night study sessions took the place of social events. Sarah's colleagues noticed how she approached each case with personal investment, particularly those involving breach of contract or betrayal of trust. She graduated summa cum laude, her name echoing through the halls as she accepted her diploma, her face showing no trace of the bride who had once been left at the altar. Meanwhile, Eric Johnson's life took a dramatically different turn. His family's wealth cushioned his fall from grace, allowing him to bounce from one exclusive club to another across Europe. He dated models, crashed expensive cars, and made headlines for all the wrong reasons. Each party seemed bigger than the last, each relationship more superficial than its predecessor. His Instagram feed became a catalog of excess, yacht parties in St. Tropez, ski weekends in the Alps, private jet rides to wherever the next distraction awaited. But in quiet moments, usually in the pre-dawn hours when the parties finally died down, memories would surface. The way Sarah used to laugh at his terrible jokes. How she'd organize his desk when he wasn't looking. The small notebook where she'd write down their future plans. These thoughts would creep in, uninvited and unwelcome, before he'd push them away with another drink, another party, another meaningless encounter. Their paths never crossed during these years, but their lives remained oddly connected through mutual acquaintances who watched both stories unfold. While Sarah's colleagues praised her rising career, Eric's friends whispered about his declining stability. She was building something substantial, he was burning through his inheritance. Sometimes, during breaks between classes or late at night in her study room, Sarah would allow herself to remember. Not the wedding day, she'd locked that away, but the smaller moments that came before. Their first meeting at a charity gala, where he'd spilled wine on her dress and spent the rest of the evening trying to make it up to her. The Sunday morning spent planning their future home. The way he'd insist on making breakfast even though he was a terrible cook. These memories would surface without warning, like old photographs discovered in a forgotten drawer. She'd examine them briefly, clinically, as if they belonged to someone else, before returning to her studies with renewed determination. Each recollection strengthened her resolve to succeed, to prove that his absence had made her stronger, not weaker. But late at night, in moments of brutal honesty, Sarah acknowledged that these memories served another purpose. They fueled a quiet, steady anger that drove her forward. Every academic achievement, every career advancement, became a silent rebuttal to Eric's abandonment. She was building a life that would eclipse the one he'd destroyed, constructing a future so bright it would blind anyone who looked too closely at her past. 7 years after the wedding that never was, Eric Johnson's carefully constructed world of excess began to crumble. The financial crisis hit his family's real estate empire hard, and years of reckless spending had already depleted his personal accounts. His second marriage to socialite Victoria Chen lasted exactly 18 months before ending in a bitter divorce that dominated the city's tabloids. The headlines that once celebrated his extravagant lifestyle now chronicled his downfall with barely concealed glee. His office, once occupying the entire top floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, downsized to a modest space in Brooklyn. The private jet was sold, the vacation homes liquidated, and the fleet of luxury cars auctioned off. The friends who had eagerly participated in his years-long party suddenly became scarce, their invitations drying up as quickly as his bank accounts. Victoria's divorce filing landed on the desk of Judge Sarah Miller on a Tuesday morning. The case file was thick with allegations and counter-allegations, property disputes, and character testimonies. Sarah's clerk noticed her hand pause momentarily over Eric's name before she continued reviewing the documents with her characteristic efficiency. If anyone detected a slight tremor in her fingers, they didn't mention it. The first hearing was scheduled for a Thursday. Sarah sat in her chambers that morning, adjusting her judge's robes with precise movements. Her reflection in the office window showed a woman transformed by time and determination. Her once soft features had sharpened, her posture radiating authority. The engagement ring that once adorned her left hand had been replaced by a simple band she'd bought herself after winning her first major case. Eric entered courtroom 302 at exactly 9 a.m. His designer suit, while still expensive, hung slightly loose on his frame. The years of excess had left their mark, gray streaked his temples, and fine lines branched from his eyes. He moved with the careful dignity of a man trying to hold onto his last shreds of pride. Their eyes met for the first time in 7 years. The courtroom fell silent, the air charged with unspoken history. Sarah's face remained impassive, a mask perfected through years of practice. But beneath her desk, her fingernails dug into her palm, leaving crescent-shaped marks that would last for hours. Eric faltered mid-step when he recognized her, his composure cracking for just a moment before he recovered. He took his seat beside his attorney, his shoulders rigid with tension. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew their history. The woman he'd left at the altar would now decide the terms of his second divorce. The proceedings began with standard formalities, but every word seemed to carry additional weight. Sarah's voice remained steady as she addressed the court, her professional demeanor never wavering. Yet those who knew her best might have noticed how she never directly looked at Eric, addressing her questions to his attorney instead. The morning stretched on, filled with legal terminology and procedural discussions. But beneath the surface, another drama played out in silent glances and careful avoidance, in the way Eric's hands shook slightly when he had to speak, in the deliberate precision with which Sarah maintained her distance. The first full hearing in Eric's divorce case began at 10 a.m. sharp. The courtroom's oak-paneled walls seemed to close in as both parties presented their initial arguments. Sarah sat behind her bench, her face a study in judicial neutrality, while her mind processed every word with razor-sharp focus. Victoria's lawyers painted Eric as reckless and unreliable, words that echoed with particular resonance in this courtroom. During the proceedings, Eric requested permission to address the court directly. Sarah's "Proceed, Mr. Johnson" came out perhaps a fraction too quickly, the first crack in her carefully maintained facade. He stood, and for a moment, looked every bit the lost man he'd become. "Your Honor," he began, his voice rougher than she remembered. "I know my reputation precedes me. The papers have documented every mistake, every failure. They call me a playboy, a wastrel, a man who runs from responsibility." He paused, his next words carrying the weight of years. "They're not wrong." The courtroom fell silent. Even Victoria's aggressive legal team stopped their constant note-taking to watch. Sarah's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her pen as Eric continued. "I've spent years running from everything that mattered. I've hurt people who trusted me, people who loved me." His eyes flickered briefly to Sarah before dropping back to his hands. "I've been running so long, I forgot how to stand still and face consequences." Sarah maintained her composure, but beneath her robes, her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't the arrogant Eric Johnson who had dominated gossip columns for years. This was someone else, someone broken, honest, and achingly familiar. "My marriage to Victoria failed because I failed. Just like I've failed at everything else that required courage, commitment, and the strength to face my own fears." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm not asking for sympathy, Your Honor. I'm asking for the chance to finally do one thing right, to end this marriage with honesty and accept the consequences of my actions." The silence that followed his speech hung heavy in the air. Sarah found herself staring at her legal pad, the notes blurring slightly before her eyes. For 7 years, she'd imagined countless scenarios of confronting Eric, but none had prepared her for this raw display of vulnerability. Victoria's lawyer jumped up to object, claiming emotional manipulation, but Sarah raised her hand for silence. Her mind raced through years of legal training, searching for the professional distance she'd worked so hard to maintain. But Eric's words had cracked something open, not just in the proceedings, but in the careful walls she'd built around her past. "The court will take a 15-minute recess," she announced, her voice steady despite the turmoil beneath. As she rose to leave the courtroom, she caught a glimpse of Eric's face. The mask of the playboy was gone, replaced by something that looked surprisingly like the men she'd once agreed to marry. In her chambers, Sarah stood at the window, watching the city below. 7 years of building a new life, of transforming herself into someone stronger, someone untouchable, and now she had to decide if justice meant punishing Eric or finding a way to help him redeem himself. Outside the courtroom, Sarah's closest friend and fellow judge, Rachel Martinez, cornered her during lunch. "You have him exactly where you want him," Rachel said, stirring her coffee with calculated precision. "He's vulnerable, his reputation is in shambles, and you hold all the power. Don't tell me you haven't thought about making him pay." Sarah's office had become a revolving door of well-meaning colleagues, each offering their own version of justified revenge. Some suggested she could find technical reasons to delay proceedings, others hinted at being particularly strict with asset division. All of them watched her with a mixture of concern and curiosity, waiting to see how she'd handle this twisted turn of fate. Meanwhile, Eric made an unexpected move that sent ripples through the legal community. Without fanfare or public announcement, he donated $5 million to the Children's Legal Defense Fund, an organization Sarah had championed since her early days as a lawyer. The donation came with no strings attached and no publicity requirements. When reporters caught wind of it and asked for comment, his only response was, "It's the right thing to do." The news reached Sarah through her clerk, who dropped the morning paper on her desk with the headline, "Fallen Tycoon Makes Anonymous Donation, Sources Reveal Johnson's Quiet Act of Charity." She sat alone in her office, reading and rereading the article, trying to decode his intentions. The organization had been struggling for funding, something she'd mentioned in passing during their engagement years ago. The fact that he remembered, that he chose this particular cause, made her hands shake as she set down the paper. That evening, Sarah found herself parked outside the Children's Legal Defense Fund office, watching as workers installed new computers and equipment purchased with Eric's donation. Through the window, she could see the excited faces of the staff who had struggled for years with outdated resources. Their joy was genuine, untainted by the complicated history behind the gift. Her phone buzzed with messages from Rachel and others, all offering different interpretations of Eric's actions. "It's manipulation," some insisted. "He's trying to buy your favor," others warned. But Sarah couldn't shake the memory of a conversation long ago, when she'd first told Eric about her passion for child advocacy. He'd listened intently, asking questions about the organization's needs and challenges. At the time, she'd been touched by his interest. Now, she wondered if that conversation had stayed with him all these years, just as it had with her. The donation forced Sarah to confront the complexity of her feelings. Her anger at Eric had been a driving force, propelling her through law school and up the judicial ladder. It was clean, simple, justified. But this act of charity complicated everything. It suggested that somewhere beneath the playboy facade and self-destructive behavior, traces of the men she'd once loved might still exist. In her car, Sarah pulled out the case files, reviewing Victoria's allegations against Eric. The claims of reckless spending and emotional distance read differently now. She found herself noting patterns, seeing not just the actions of a careless rich man, but the behavior of someone running from their own demons. Mark Stevens, a rising star in corporate law, had been a constant presence in Sarah's professional life since the divorce proceedings began. His expertise in high-profile cases made him a natural consultant, but his attention to Sarah extended beyond legal matters. He brought her coffee just the way she liked it, stayed late to help her review cases, and his genuine warmth provided a sharp contrast to the emotional turbulence of Eric's case. During lunch breaks, Mark would share stories about his pro bono work with domestic abuse survivors, his eyes lighting up with the same passion for justice that Sarah recognized in herself. His presence offered a glimpse of what a normal relationship might look like, one built on shared values and mutual respect rather than the intense, complicated history she shared with Eric. One evening, as they reviewed case files together, Mark's hand brushed against hers while reaching for a document. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through Sarah, reminding her that she'd kept her heart locked away for 7 years. Mark looked at her with an intensity that suggested he'd been waiting for the right moment to acknowledge the growing connection between them. Eric noticed these interactions from his position at the defendant's table. He watched as Mark leaned close to whisper something in Sarah's ear, saw the slight smile that crossed her face in response. Each small gesture between them felt like a personal defeat, another reminder of what he'd thrown away. During recesses, he observed their easy rapport through the courtroom windows, his jaw tightening every time he heard Sarah's quiet laugh at something Mark had said. The tension came to a head during an afternoon session when Eric was testifying about his assets. His voice grew strained as he noticed Mark slip into the courtroom and take a seat near Sarah's bench. The properties in question, Eric continued, his words becoming more clipped, were acquired during a period when I was not making the best decisions. Sarah watched as Eric's composure cracked slightly. His testimony wandered from financial facts into personal territory. I spent years trying to fill a void with meaningless acquisitions, he admitted, his eyes fixed on a point just above Sarah's head. Everything I bought, every investment I made, was an attempt to replace something I'd lost, something I threw away. The raw honesty in his voice made Sarah grip her gavel tighter. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing the undercurrent of emotion that had nothing to do with property division. The courtroom fell silent as Eric continued, each word laden with unspoken meaning. Your Honor, he said, finally meeting Sarah's eyes directly, I've spent 7 years surrounded by wealth and luxury, but I've never felt poorer than the day I walked away from true happiness. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. Beside her, Mark's presence suddenly felt like an intrusion into a moment that belonged to a different timeline, a different life. The professional distance she'd maintained began to blur, memories of shared dreams and promises mixing with the reality of her current life. The courtroom transformed into an arena of unspoken emotions during the next session. As Victoria's lawyers presented evidence of Eric's financial mismanagement, Sarah found herself remembering conversations from years ago, discussions about their future, dreams of building something meaningful together. Each exhibit felt like a chapter in a story she knew too well, bank statements showing massive withdrawals at exclusive clubs, credit card bills from luxury hotels, receipts that traced Eric's path of self-destruction. During cross-examination, Eric's voice took on a different tone. Those expenses, he said, gesturing to the projected spreadsheets, they all happened after March 15th. The date hung in the air, their wedding day. I can tell you exactly what each purchase was trying to replace. The yacht in Monaco. That was supposed to be our honeymoon. The house in Aspen. We planned to build our first home together. Sarah's pen stilled on her legal pad. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Eric continued, his professional facade crumbling with each word. Every extravagant purchase, every reckless investment, was me trying to outrun the biggest mistake of my life. He turned to face Sarah directly, protocol forgotten. You became a judge because you believe in justice, in making things right. I became a cautionary tale because I couldn't face what I'd done wrong. His voice cracked. You turned your pain into purpose. I turned mine into chaos. Sarah fought to maintain her composure, her judicial robe feeling suddenly heavy on her shoulders. She'd spent years building her reputation as a fair, impartial judge, but now her courtroom had become the stage for a reckoning 7 years in the making. Mr. Johnson, she managed, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, the court is interested in facts pertaining to your current divorce proceedings. The facts, Your Honor, are that I never stopped loving you. The words exploded in the quiet courtroom. Victoria's lawyers jumped to object, but Eric continued. Everything that followed, my marriage to Victoria, the spending, the parties, it was all because I couldn't admit that I made the biggest mistake of my life that day. Sarah's gavel came down hard, the sound echoing off the wooden walls. Mr. Johnson, this is neither the time nor the place for personal declarations. But even as she spoke the words, memories flooded back, their first date, the way he proposed on a rainy Sunday morning, the countless small moments that had made their love feel inevitable. You're right, Your Honor, Eric responded, composing himself. But you should know that watching you become this person, this strong, principled judge, it's shown me exactly what I walked away from. You didn't just survive what I did, you transformed it into something remarkable. The weight of 7 years hung between them. Sarah realized that her journey to the bench, her dedication to justice, had been shaped by the men standing before her. Every case she'd handled with unwavering fairness, every decision she'd made with careful consideration, had been influenced by her determination to rise above personal pain. The following days of the trial brought new complications. While reviewing case documents late one evening, Sarah discovered Eric's proposal for a community youth legal education program. The detailed plan, submitted as part of his asset disclosure, outlined a comprehensive initiative to teach underprivileged teenagers about their legal rights. The program would operate in the same neighborhoods where Sarah had started her legal career. The proposal wasn't just a vague promise, it came with committed funding, partnerships with local schools, and a detailed curriculum. Sarah found herself reading through the materials multiple times, noting how the program addressed exactly the gaps she'd identified years ago when they discussed her dreams of making legal education accessible to everyone. Mark appeared in her office doorway as she studied the documents. It's a solid proposal, he admitted reluctantly. But you know it's also strategic. He's trying to show personal growth, influence the proceedings. He moved closer, placing a coffee on her desk. Don't let him manipulate you with grand gestures. But Sarah recognized something in the proposal that others missed. The details, the specific schools chosen, the focus on practical legal knowledge, even the teaching methods suggested, they all aligned with ideas she'd shared with Eric during their engagement. Ideas she thought he'd forgotten along with everything else they'd planned together. During the next session, Eric presented the program to the court. This isn't about improving my image, he stated, his voice steady. It's about finally doing something meaningful with the privileges I've taken for granted. Something that matters. Sarah watched him closely as he outlined the initiative. The old Eric would have delegated such a presentation to his lawyers, but here he was, personally explaining each aspect with genuine enthusiasm. She noticed how he'd lost the polished artifice that had defined him during his Playboy years. In its place was something more authentic, a man finally growing into the person he could have been. Meanwhile, Mark's constant presence offered a different future. He represented stability, uncomplicated affection, and a shared passion for justice. During breaks, he'd discuss his own community projects, his plans for expanding access to legal aid. His path forward was clear, unmarred by past mistakes or complicated histories. Sarah found herself at a crossroads. Eric's proposal demonstrated real change, but accepting it meant acknowledging that the man who'd hurt her so deeply was capable of transformation. Mark's steady affection promised a fresh start, free from the weight of past betrayals. The choice between them became a test of her own capacity for growth, whether she could trust her judgment about Eric's sincerity, and whether she could open herself to new possibilities with Mark. The program proposal sat on her desk like a bridge between past and present, forcing her to question whether justice sometimes meant allowing space for redemption, even when personal history suggested otherwise. That night, in her Upper West Side apartment, Sarah dreamed of the past for the first time in years. In her dream, she stood in the garden where Eric had proposed, but everything was different. The flowers bloomed in shades of blue instead of red, and Eric wore his current face, older, lined with experience, eyes carrying the weight of regret. "I've been trying to tell you something for 7 years," Dream Eric said, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of a gavel. She woke at 3 a.m., her judicial robe hanging on the bedroom door like a shadow. The dream clung to her consciousness, mixing with memories of recent courtroom exchanges. Outside her window, Manhattan's lights blurred through unexpected tears. The next morning, the courthouse felt charged with possibility. Mark waited by her chambers with coffee, his reliable presence both comforting and somehow insufficient. Victoria's lawyers prepared their final arguments, armed with spreadsheets and testimonies. Eric sat at his table, hands clasped, looking not at his lawyers but at the empty judge's chair. Sarah entered the courtroom last, her robe settling around her shoulders like armor. The familiar routine of legal proceedings felt suddenly inadequate for the weight of this moment. As she took her seat, she noticed how the morning light streamed through the high windows, creating patterns on the wooden panels, the same patterns she'd admired in the church 7 years ago. The final arguments began. Victoria's lawyer painted a picture of reckless abandon and emotional neglect. Eric's team countered with evidence of recent changes, rehabilitation efforts, and community contributions. But beneath the legal arguments ran a deeper current of understanding between two people who had once planned to spend their lives together. Sarah felt every eye in the courtroom on her as she prepared to speak. Mark watched from his usual spot, his presence representing one possible future. Eric sat perfectly still, embodying another. The weight of both possibilities pressed against her judicial objectivity. "Before I deliver my judgment," she began, her voice clear in the hushed courtroom, "I need to address something." She paused, feeling the moment balance on a knife's edge. This court has witnessed not just the dissolution of a marriage, but the transformation of a person. Eric's head lifted slightly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time that day. In that look, 7 years of unspoken words passed between them. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing the change in the air. "The law asks us to judge actions, to weigh evidence, to determine fair distribution of assets," Sarah continued. "But sometimes, justice requires us to see beyond immediate circumstances to the larger arc of human growth." The courtroom remained silent as she spoke, every person present aware that this was more than a divorce proceeding. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for Eric and Victoria, but for Sarah herself, a judge tasked with measuring not only the value of property but the worth of redemption. The tension in the courtroom peaked as Sarah prepared to deliver her final words. She'd removed her reading glasses, choosing to face this moment with complete clarity. 7 years ago, she began, surprising everyone with this personal reference, "I learned that loss isn't just about what happened, but about what could have been." The gallery sat motionless as she continued, "During these proceedings, we've examined bank statements, property deeds, and financial records. But beneath these material concerns, we've witnessed something rarer, genuine transformation." Victoria's lawyers shifted nervously as Sarah turned her attention to the divorce settlement. "The court rules the following: the financial settlement will proceed as negotiated, with one condition." She paused, her next words carefully chosen. "Mr. Johnson's proposed youth legal education program will be established as an independent trust, with guaranteed funding from both parties' assets. This program will serve as a legacy that transforms personal failure into public good." Then, reaching into her desk, Sarah withdrew an envelope that showed signs of age. "Mr. Johnson, during discovery, this was submitted as evidence but never presented." She held up a letter dated 1 week after their failed wedding. The envelope was addressed to her old apartment, but had never been sent. Eric's face drained of color as he recognized his own handwriting. "Your Honor, I..." He started, but Sarah raised her hand for silence. "This letter," she continued, "written 7 years ago, details not just remorse, but an understanding of the damage caused by impulsive actions. It shows that growth doesn't always happen in straight lines. Sometimes it takes years of wrong turns before we find our way back to truth." She looked directly at Mark, whose expression showed dawning understanding. Then at Eric, who sat straighter under her gaze. "The court has one final observation: true justice isn't about punishment or revenge. It's about restoration, not necessarily of what was, but of what could be." Standing, Sarah made her final proclamation, This case has shown us that redemption is possible, but it must be earned through actions, not just words. Mr. Johnson, your recent choices demonstrate this understanding. The divorce is granted, with the stipulations outlined regarding the youth program. As the courtroom began to empty, Sarah added one last statement, and the letter she picked it up will remain sealed. Some words belong to the past, while actions speak to the future. She gathered her robes and stepped down from the bench. Mark quietly collected his things and left without speaking. He'd recognized something in her voice that told him their story had ended before it truly began. Eric remained seated, staring at the letter he'd written 7 years ago but never had the courage to send. The afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the empty courtroom. Sarah placed the letter in her chamber's desk drawer, next to her original engagement ring. Some things needed to stay in the past, she realized, so that new beginnings could take root in their place. As she left the courthouse that evening, Sarah felt lighter. She had dispensed justice not just according to the law, but with wisdom born from her own journey through pain to purpose. The future stretched before her, no longer shadowed by what might have been, but brightened by what could still be.